I'd never heard of it. It wasn't the cancer I expected. It wasn't related to the first one. And I was a stranger in a strange land. What is it? Who else has it? What are the treatments? What doctors know anything about it? And am I going to die? Life living with two blood cancers is a worry because you have it and you never really know how it's going to affect you that day, that week, that month. And you just hope you have the right doctors and the right treatment so you can have it under control. I was getting leg cramps. And, I would go to the gym and I thought, oh, I pulled a muscle. And I was at a shopping mall with my wife one evening and I was having trouble walking and I didn't say anything to her. But we got home, she went to bed, our youngest child went to bed, the others were away at school. And I called the consulting nurse, which we had through our insurance plan. And I said, maybe I pulled a muscle, but said, well, we're going to have a doctor call you. I said, oh. So the doctor called and he said, well, can you stretch your leg this way and that way? And I said, yeah. He said, well, is your leg red? I said, yeah, my right calf is red. Is it hot? He said, yeah. I, he said, it's not a pulled muscle. He said, you need to go to the emergency room. I said, what? He said, it could be a deep vein thrombosis. What's that? It's a clot in your leg. So my wife was asleep. My kid was asleep. I said, do I need an ambulance? He said, no, but I'm going to call the emergency room. They'll be expecting you. Drive over there. Drove there. They do an ultrasound. Then the emergency room doctor comes in a little while later and he says, congratulations, you have a deep vein thrombosis in your right calf, but you also have it in your left leg, and I'm putting you in the hospital. Okay, so what happened was I had this deep vein thrombosis. I ended up being in a clinical trial for a blood thinner. But as they followed me, the investigator called me one day and he said, something's crazy with your blood. You need some blood tests. So I had them. I got a call from my hematologist who said, your blood's out of whack. I think you have something called myelofibrosis. What the hell is that? It's scarring in your bone marrow. And quite frankly, the treatment could be a transplant. Ooh, I knew that was a big deal. And, but he said, well, watch it. And I happen to have been going as a patient advocate to a blood cancer medical convention. And I told some of the doctors there, hey, I got a call. I might have myelofibrosis. And they were not upbeat at all. But one of them was a specialist. He said, you come see me. And that guy was a world famous myelofibrosis doctor. And eventually I got on treatment that had just been approved. Well, I had been diagnosed a long time before, 1996, with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which I'd never heard of. And I thought I was dead then. And I was in a clinical trial and it worked and had a long remission. I was always worried about the remission ending for that blood cancer. And I never expected that I'd have something else. But I think cancer patients need to be aware that our immune system is not the greatest. And whatever led to the first cancer could lead to another cancer. And so that's what happened. So I was shocked when I was diagnosed with myelofibrosis. I'd never heard of it. It wasn't the cancer I expected. It wasn't related to the first one. And I was a stranger in a strange land. I mean, what is it? Who else has it? What are the treatments? What doctors know anything about it? And am I going to die? And fortunately, there was a new treatment that had just been approved, and the hope was is that that could make a real difference. And the good news is it did. I'm not a particularly emotional person. I'm pretty low key. My wife, not so much, but I am. And it's the uncertainty is what I think is really tough when you have any cancer, really, but a blood cancer. So there's this disease flowing around your body. Like today, I have some new bruises from low platelets, right? What's my blood count going to show? So it's the uncertainty of what's going on today, but it's also where is this headed? Am I going to crash and burn? Is my life going to be shorter, or is it just a temporary blip in the road, which helps to have really good healthcare providers you trust? So, really, it's you're kind of testing yourself all the time. Can I ride the bike? Could I jog, which I don't anymore? Um, could I, just live a successful day? And so that's to the good. What's to the less good is your worry about tomorrow or the next day. And if you have a loved one, I've been married almost 40 years, you say, what would life be like for her if I wasn't here? And I worry about that. Okay. So I try to celebrate every day, give her lots of hugs, and just do as well as I can and have the healthcare team that can help us and share my feelings. I talk to my wife about what I'm feeling, not everything, but most. Um, and I try to be a glass half full kind of guy, you know. Here, I feel good today. Let's go do it. So I think that's the first thing is what do you have and do you have the right team? And then I think it's really communication with the healthcare team, but it's also connecting with other patients. I really believe that's helpful with a caveat. That other person, very well meaning, who may have myelofibrosis, may have a different version of it, or they may have other health conditions that affect it differently, or a medicine that works for you may not work for them, or a dosage that you take may not work for them. So, hold hands, give each other hugs, and say, God, none of us wanted this, and we're going to do our best to get through it, but we may have a little different journey. But make the connection with other people. And fortunately, there are a number of organizations now in Europe, around the world, in the US, for people with myelofibrosis. There's some private Facebook pages. There are other sources of information like the patient story that provide great information, but connect with other patients as well, and then go live your life. I'll give you an example just today. So I've been concerned about bruises that I've been getting. So I wrote the nurse case manager for my doctor, and she wrote me back immediately. And I'm actually going to get a blood test today. What's going on with my platelets? Because my platelets have been lower. And I've also noticed some new bruises and some other things. I got a blood blister in my mouth that was really concerning. So I'm not waiting for a checkup. I'm calling. I'm going on. In our case, we can use something called My Chart. Some people have that at their hospital, but some portal where you can go to, or you just call, say, I need to talk to the nurse. Typically, the nurse is your best friend because they'll escalate it to the doctor if they're concerned and they can make things happen. So I would say the nurse is your best friend. Don't hesitate to call if there's something changing or you're worried about something, new symptom. just don't feel right, whatever. And of course, with myelofibrosis, um, you can tell a lot from a blood test, So what are your counts? And have they changed dramatically? And if so, does there need to be some intervention, some kind of infusion or something else? And I've had all of that. But I would say me saying, this doesn't seem right to me. What do you think? And they say, well, let's look into it. Let's get a blood test, etc. Now we're going to do this. Okay. But I was often the one and am the one who gets the train moving. And that's self-advocacy. You may not be comfortable with self-advocacy, but you may have a friend or a spouse. You might have an adult child who can be your advocate. Let them do that. Now, not to drive people crazy, not to be disrespectful with the healthcare team, but say, hey, I'm worried about mom because this has been happening and we're concerned. How do we look into it? Perfectly fine. Okay. So it may be the patient, it may be that wider circle of a loved one. We're all patients, right? And we all represent the patient. Let's all be advocates. So every year, the leading blood cancer experts from around the world get together. It's a huge meeting. I call it the World Series of Blood Cancer. And so we sat down with one of the leading myelofibrosis experts. So I connected with Dr. John Mascarenhas, who I've known for many years. He's from the Tisch Cancer Institute at Mount Sinai in New York. He's a really world-renowned researcher and expert in MPNs. And we talked about so many things that will help people with any MPN really understanding the latest information, making sense of it all. Here's what he said. So let me start with the 10,000 foot level first. You go to this conference and day to day, you're both with patients and you're looking at the science. Are you encouraged for us? Because we saw progress in other blood cancers. Is it now starting to blossom in MPNs and specifically for myelofibrosis?
Yeah, I mean, so I think in short, the answer is yes. I am encouraged. I think that's a fundamental defect that I have, that I continue to be optimistic no matter what we're looking at. And that optimism, has been maintained over almost 20 years at this point, that we continue to move in the right direction. Unfortunately, often not fast enough for our patients. But what I've seen is the evolution of, the JAK inhibitor era, which you alluded to, where we have 4 JAK inhibitors that are approved that allow us to tailor and personalize the therapy to patients based on their patient profile and their blood counts, and even provide serial sequencing of JAK inhibitors. But that isn't enough. So there's been a lot of interest as we understand the disease biology even greater than we did in 2005 when JAK2 mutation was first discovered. We now recognize that there's a greater degree of complexity and heterogeneity amongst patients. So there are a lot of different pathways that do appear to be very important and relevant to the physiology and the pathophysiology of this disease. And there is a real interest in targeting the malignant stem cell, that grandmother cell that originated the disease, in which we are looking for those vulnerabilities in those pathways in that cell population that would allow us to ultimately delete that cell to provide deeper responses, even at what I would say would be curative approaches. Because outside of transplantation, the therapies we have don't actually cure patients. They do address issues, which are not unimportant, whether it's symptoms, spleen, cytopenias, low blood counts. And I do think that doing that improves how patients do and ultimately prolongs survival. But what we're really looking to do is use these findings, leverage these findings from the lab to find therapies that actually change the disease course, that can improve outcomes like survival and progression-free survivals. All right. Well, we're going to go through sort of a little bit of a laundry list as we dig into it of different drugs that have been mentioned. Some of us have never heard of them, but I just want to go over what you said so I understand.
So first, you're trying to go back to the very basics of cancer. What went haywire in a patient who ends up with a bone marrow problem, right? That leads to one of the MPNs. And can you shut that down at the earliest stage by understanding it? Now, over the last few years, your scientific community has identified different oncogenes, cancer genes, that have been responsible for that. And you talked about the heterogeneity, the differences of us. Some of us have CALR, some of us have JAK2, some of us have MIPL, etc. Is that understanding helping?
Well, I do think it helps because we recognize that it's not a monolithic disease and that the different mutations that we call the driver mutations and the different amounts of those mutations that are understood to be present in the bone marrow cells, as well as the sequence in which the mutations arose, all tell a picture. It paints a picture of complexity at the molecular and cellular level that explains why there's heterogeneity at the clinical level, why some patients have very high white counts and some patients have very low platelet counts. Some patients have very big spleens, and some patients have a lot more anemia and transfusion dependence. So it can all be explained relatively to the biology, to these mutations, and to the effects of these mutations. The next step, once we've realized that, which I think we've come to that realization, is how do you take all that complex data, and it's a lot of complex data, and that's where things like maybe artificial intelligence and machine learning will help us move the field forward, as it's doing with other sciences. And how do we distill that to help us understand how best do we then target those cells based on that complexity, that genomic complexity? So I do think we're moving in this direction of deeper understanding of the biology from the molecular standpoint. That informs us with both prognostication, which is important, but most importantly, I think therapeutic implications. So I'll give you an example of where I think that might make that might make sense. There is substantial. So, for example, there is substantial data that would suggest that certain mutations, likely influence outcomes and responses to treatment. For example, if you have high molecular risk mutations, these could be mutations in ASXL1, EZH2, IDH, mutations that some patients may have heard of and even have seen on their reports and can ask their physicians, do I have these? Because most patients will have had NGS, next generation sequencing. So looking at these gene panels and seeing, do mutations exist in any given individual? And what does that mean? Well, we know that some of these mutations can have influence prognosis and outcome. And some of these mutations and the presence of them, even more than one mutation, could even predict for a lesser response to drugs like ruxolitinib, a lesser robust spleen and symptom response, a shorter duration of response, a quicker time to failure of drugs like that. So knowing that up front may be strategic in understanding how better to approach diseases rather than give the same drug for everybody.
Okay, so I want to do a little promo for patients now, and that is wherever you may be watching this, I think this advocacy for next generation sequencing, NGS as he referred to, so that a picture of, I almost think of it like a modern art painting with red and blue and splattered over here and stuff like that. What are your colors, right? And then hopefully with some consultation with an MPN specialist, how does either the current therapies or maybe in a clinical trial, investigational ones, apply to your specific situation at that time? And I think you also mentioned, John, how the genes that are driving our illness may evolve. So what the story is today may not be the story in a year or two or three. I've been living with myelofibrosis since 2011. It has been pretty stable, and it has been driven by the JAK2 V617F. Now, that brings us to current therapies, John. You mentioned at the beginning about the 4 current approved JAK inhibitors. They have nuances, and it would seem like the choice of which one or sequencing, as you said, may vary by patient based on their situation, right? But I mean, we have good drugs. It's like, where do you start? And then we'll go on with our discussion of building on that as far as combinations. So how do you know where to start?
We are blessed that we have choices today because it wasn't always the case. So I think what's nice is that we can have opportunities to select drugs that may be best suited for different subsets of patients. So, for example, patients with low platelets, what we call the cytopenic profile of patients. These could be patients with platelets of 50,000 or even less, or even patients between 50 and 100,000. I would say low platelets less than 100,000 may be best served by drugs that are easily delivered and have rationale in that patient population, namely pacritinib over ruxolitinib, in which we know platelets often limit the ability to dose up on ruxolitinib. Fedratinib even more recently had some data in the patient platelets between 50 to 100,000, providing some more security there. So we know that platelets could be a determinant of which one of the JAK inhibitors you're going to select. Anemia is another one that's gotten a lot of attention because anemia can be a major issue for patients at presentation during their clinical course and can worsen over time. And that ruxolitinib, great drug, can worsen anemia for some patients. It may not be the best therapy in that setting. So drugs like momelotinib or even pacritinib that inhibit ACVR1, a different protein, can improve anemia in some patients. So we use the patient profiles to help us understand maybe which drugs to choose from. But I will say that for the most part, most patients will start with ruxolitinib. It is the oldest, it's the most familiar, it is probably still one of the best drugs that I've ever seen in this field in terms of achieving its goals. But again, not every patient fits the bill, and you can sort of tweak that as needed.
At ASH, and I think a lot of studies during the year talk about building on ruxolitinib, Jakafi or Jakavi in Europe. And I'm sure there's discussion about building on one of these other JAK inhibitors as well. So is a 1-2 punch necessarily better? Is that where you're headed?
Well, it's definitely what we're interested in asking. So the question that is being asked in a lot of the clinical trials, particularly these mature clinical trials, is simply we have these JAK inhibitors at our disposal, and they're beneficial, but they're not sufficient. We have other drugs that have now demonstrated clinical activity and are rational and are validated in preclinical models, so systems that will help us understand whether it makes sense to take it into a patient. And these are drugs like pelabresib and imetelstat and nabtemadilin and selenex are all funny sounding names, but each drug has rationale and each drug is active, even as a single agent in these diseases. But the questions that are being asked now, is it better to combine the two drugs? If you look throughout oncology, most of oncology is treated with combinations of therapy. It's very rare to find an oncologic disease, a malignant disease, whether it's of the blood or of the solid malignancy, where we use one agent, and then if it fails, we go to a single subsequent agent. Usually, it's combinations of therapy that are more potent together. A term we often use is synergize. Suppose I know that everyone understands what that word really means. It really means that if you take either drug alone, you can do this in a lab, and you expose them to malignant cells, that the combination of the two drugs works better than 1+1. It's almost 1+1+1. You get even better effects in terms of killing or limiting those cells, those malignant cells. So we hope to replicate what we see in the lab or in mice that are engineered to have these diseases in humans.
We want to live longer for sure, but we want to live well. So could you talk about the power of the combinations, but the worry about additional side effects?
Absolutely. I'll give you a prime example where 1+1 can equal 3 from an efficacy standpoint, but might still equal 1 from a safety standpoint. So a great example of that is the Manifest-2 study, where we took JAK inhibitor naive patients and with myelofibrosis, and we randomized them to standard of care that would be ruxolitinib plus a placebo. That's double blinded, so the patients and the investigators don't know what that person is getting, only a computer knows, versus ruxolitinib, which is Jakafi, plus the study drug pelabresib, which is an oral BET inhibitor, a very rational drug, which modeling has shown us should synergize very nicely with Jakafi. And the answer is it did, efficacy-wise. If you look at 24 weeks, very profound reductions in spleen and I would argue very profound reductions in symptoms. And if you look at the biomarkers, the bone marrow fibrosis reduction was far more significant. The reductions in inflammatory cytokines, the reductions in JAK2 mutation, everything aligned with superiority of the two. But most intriguingly, if you looked at the safety, there was less grade 3, 4 treatment emergent side effects with the combination than with the single agent. And I've never seen that before, really, where you took two active agents, you combined them, you got almost double the clinical activity, and you got less toxicity. So there's a great example, and what I hope is reassuring for patients that double the action doesn't mean double the trouble.
Am I hopeful living with myelofibrosis and an MPN? Yes. Do I think you should be hopeful? Yes, and I think we've heard that from Dr. Mascarenhas. Really, there's a lot of research going on. There's some very dedicated people who are trying to make us better or even find a cure. And so I think for any of us, it's have the right healthcare team, have the best possible treatment now, make adjustments to the treatment as better ones come along. And I think go live your life. That's what I do. I can't do everything I used to do, but I do a lot. And I push that envelope. So we travel, we spend time with our kids and grandkids, we go out, we're careful, of course, about taking care of ourselves. Do all that, but go live your life. And I think have a great deal of hope. I know I do.